We have approval of the agenda.
Motion to approve the agenda?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. Approval of the minutes. Copy of the minutes from our April 22nd meeting were sent out. Does anyone have any, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Second. Any further discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right. Discussion items. Send it over to Clara for, we have 2 discussion items on the agenda, sign ordinance updates first, and then parking in B6 zones.
Yep. Okay, so it's been a while since we've touched our sign ordinance updates, and what had been requested was kind of a comparison document that showed where the code had been and the direction that we're heading now. I've also made a few other changes to the code as we've been working on this, so I will attempt to address those as we go. But in front of you is your packet. It's about 37 pages long, and we do have a missing last, or 36 pages. There's a missing last page, so if your copy doesn't have a page 36, let me know, because we've got it sitting here. But the black text that you see is all of the original code language. The red text is additions to the language or changes to the language. And what I've done is I've done them just a page for each section so that if you want to take notes or do any writing in the margins, you've got plenty of space to do that. And I think we're just going to kind of run through some of the changes to remind ourselves where we have been with it, and then maybe just see what other discussions need to take place before we feel like we're in a good spot to maybe move this ahead to council. So, something gonna work? Anything? There we go. All right, so the first section, the section generally is, we're not making any changes to that. Okay, it won't pull up, so we'll just keep going this way. Findings, purpose, and effect is an addition to the code. This is just a summary of the language that's proposed in red on pages 3 and 4. So the findings are that signs can impact the environmental character and quality of our community, and they also convey important messages. They can cause traffic hazards, aesthetic issues, and reduce property values. So that's why essentially we're going to be regulating them within our city code. We're also trying to prevent visual clutter. We're going to enforce fair and consistent sign regulations. And the effect of these purposes is that signs are allowed if they comply. There can be lots of different kinds of signs in commercial zones. Our residential zones are obviously more restrictive. Small, unobtrusive signs are permitted if compliant. That one I might consider removing because we had previous language that said any sign under 3 feet of area was just simply allowed. And I don't know that we kept that in at this point, so I might remove that. But for now, it's there. And then prohibit signs that negatively affect the environment and public welfare. I don't know what that actually looks like in reality, but we can leave that in or we can remove it. But for now, it's been in. Okay, come on.
So your language up on the screen is an abbreviated version of what we're looking at?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, severability, this is also an addition to the text. If any part of this article is found to be invalid, it does not affect the validity of the rest. We have that same language elsewhere in code. Definitions is, again, an addition. We did not have definitions before. And, ooh, sorry, my spacing got real off on that. But we are adding all of these words as definitions, and this is actually a slightly pared down list than what we've seen before. I went through and I just double checked words to see if there were mentions of them elsewhere in our code or not. If they weren't in there anywhere else, I just removed them. Or if there were ways that I could combine words, I also did that. So this is what we're left with all of our new definitions. Comments? Questions? Pretty good, right?
Great job so far.
Yeah, it's super fun to have all of these now. Okay. So moving on, page 11. Licenses and permit fees. I'm going to suggest that we delete this section and replace it with the section called permit required, which is on page 12. This is the section that we've talked about before, where we have the application process laid out for a sign permit. This is one of the places where in other versions of code, not including ours, but in other communities, what they've done is said if you have a sign that's of a certain size, you don't need to do an application. We have never operated in that way, and I feel like our code clarifies what's allowed by kind of sign rather than size. So I've removed that language. So now the permit is any signs will require a permit unless they're in the next section, which is the ones that are exempt. So moving on. These are our exemptions. We are not going to require any signs that are legally required to have a permit, which that's what we've always done. We obviously do not have any say in signs that are inside of a building. Works of art, so a mural or like what you see on the senior center over there would not require any kind of a sign permit. That would just be something that they could work out with the building owner. Lost pet signs are allowed with some regulation. No trespassing, hunting, fishing signs are allowed. Again, I think our original code language had them much smaller. It was like a 1 foot by 2 foot sign would be allowed. We had discussion about that at one of our previous meetings, that might be too small of a sign, so that has been upped to 2 feet by 3 feet, which I think is reasonable. And then menu board signs, which is an addition to our code. We did not have that before, but if we have new restaurants coming in and they want to do a drive-through, they will get that permitted through the building permit process because it goes in with all of the work being done through the building permit rather than having to get a separate sign permit for that. It just made sense when talking with the building official to include that as an exemption. Continuing, this is the section that we included about sandwich board signs. We had a lot of back and forth about sandwich board signs. Staff in the administrator's office is still interested in including sandwich board language. So if we want to go over that any further, we can. Otherwise, I've just included what we've discussed in the past and what the administrator's office is comfortable with, as well as the city attorney. Any comments about that section before we move on? Okay. And then these are our final exemptions: flags and flagpoles, garage sale signs. We then point to Chapter 118 with the regulations on garage sale signs. Non-commercial signs when permanently or temporary installed in a residential zone. So essentially that's saying if somebody has one of those signs that says all are welcome or I believe in science or something like that, we're gonna just say it's your property. You may put up a sign like that if you'd like. We'd like them to stay in nice condition. If they start to look really tattered, we can maybe send a letter from the code enforcement office that says, you know, hey, maybe buy a new one if you really feel attached to this message. But as of right now, we just don't have the staff to regulate having those in the yard or telling people that they can't have them in the yard. So it seems like a reasonable addition to say that those are allowed regardless of election time. That said, those are different than election signs because we have a separate definition for election signs. Election signs are only allowed surrounding an election, and those have state-regulated rules that surround them. We've included that language in our exemptions, pointing to Minnesota state statutes so that people can go back to that if they have any questions. And we added the addition of window signs, which we have not mentioned before, but have them here. And we will not be including window signs in the area of signage on the front of a building. So if you have a window sign, we're not including that to be part of, say, a sign that's on your building. Does that make sense? Cool. Electrical signs, there's nothing exciting about this. This is just saying, follow electrical code. And this refers to the building official who will give them a separate permit. This is defining our unauthorized signs, which you can't have fake traffic signs. You can't do anything like that. Don't stick stuff on rocks and trees, blah, blah, blah. Just the general, keep things neat and tidy if possible. Another new section is computation methods. We have not had that in there before. This just lays out for people exactly how we do our computations of the area so that when they're submitting their applications, they understand what is being looked at. If a sign has a background, we include the background. If it's just standalone letters, we will just take the area of the letters and add those together. That's the overall area. And then it explains how you determine the height as well. And then if you remember, we added some diagrams that they had in the Duluth sign code, so that will end up in our city code too, because they were just a nice visual. I didn't include them in this slideshow, but they exist. Signs on canopies, marquees, and fixed awnings. We really don't get a lot of questions about those. That said, we do now have an awning sign downtown. So I felt like even if we don't deal with a lot of them, it's still probably good to have the language in there. So this language was included. Again, it was not in our original code. Then moving on to page, which one has this? 20. This is probably going to require some one-on-one time looking at this and just determining if this is capturing what we want it to capture. I'm really struggling with how to format so that these tables fit. Right now, there's kind of just a lot of information, so I'm probably going to keep working on these at least for another couple weeks. Because I'm not really sure how they're going to show up in our code and if they're going to be readable. I like the idea of them, I just don't know the execution at this point. So any thoughts or ideas are welcome at this point for making these sections more readable for people, even if that means moving away from our table idea. It could just be paring it way down as well. So just some thoughts. So we'll come back to the table discussions. But let's look at page 28. This was based on conversation that we had a couple months ago about billboards. Do you have a question?
Kind of.
Go for it.
I might wait till the end. Well, I feel like after all this, I'd be like sort of hard pressed to find a sign that we don't talk about in our code. And I'm wondering, where do we handle just generally signs that aren't covered or aren't properly introduced as a sign, in the definition section or somewhere else? Like in the proposed code, like where would we handle that
Where would we
request?
handle
Yeah, or like the regulation of it.
Well, what are you imagining that kind of a sign to be?
Well, I mean, I think ideally we would, and someone would be applying to like put up a sign, or there's instances where you don't. You just get to, I think, right? You can correct me on that. I need to get kind of caught up here. But
Yeah. The idea would be more that there wouldn't be a scenario where you're not at least asking the city about putting up a sign. Like you'd be working with a sign hanger. It would be done with the building official taking a look at it after it's completed. So you'd be going through the process kind of regardless.
yeah, I see that there, there would definitely be a process there. There's tends to be in these this sort of like default category where if it's not all of the things that we have said it could be.
I
but
see,
it-
like a catch-all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know, attorneys.
I mean, I'm not saying it's imperative, but I'm wondering, what would I do if I didn't,
If you didn't see where your sign
Yeah,
was.
yeah, because we've gotten so exhaustive now with the list that,
Well, is there some language we could use that would capture?
I mean, at this, wouldn't mind just putting the thought out there for us to come back to. And I haven't had a chance to digest this either, but it's something I would look for ordinarily.
Yeah, I think after we go through it today, we should make a note of that comment. And after we go through it today, I guess my thought would be that everyone would kind of take this packet and spend some time with it, come back next month and be able to have a more educated, thought-out discussion on it, and hopefully at that point, we can move it forward to the council. But this is really good. Being able to see what was there and what's changed.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
we're
super
really-
helpful.
We're really adding a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
this is essentially a completely new section of code.
Right.
So, okay. Signs that don't fit current. So I know we're going to come back to this, but is my brain going in the right direction? So we have a section on unauthorized signs. What if we just had a section on authorized signs? That kind of leaves it up to interpretation of the zoning administrator.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've touched on this before, actually, because we had talked about the purpose and intent section in relationship to the zoning administrator's ability to decide to approve or not approve a sign. I just can't remember if it was in the context of signs that aren't contemplated here or listed here. But I do agree with all the work we've gone through. I feel like we've captured almost every sign under the sun.
Okay, I'll look at maybe clarifying. I'll look at where we talk about zoning administration and see if there's a spot that makes sense to add some language like that. That's a really good point, though. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so with the billboards, we had discussed allowing billboards in B5 and B6, which we did not allow before, and none of us could really tell why that was the case. So they are now included. You can have a billboard in a B5, B6 per this change to the code. And then we'd also discussed some best practices for the amount of space between billboards. And initially, it was 800 feet that we required between billboards unless they were directly back to back. I did some looking at state regulations, even along interstates in the state of Minnesota. The farthest apart that the state says they should be is 500 feet. So thinking about being in town and the speed at which people are traveling, like if you're on an interstate and your signs are only 500 feet apart, you probably don't need them to be 800 feet in town. So I matched it to be 400 feet, which is the same length of space that we require for electronic message centers to be away from residential zones. So I thought that was maybe a number that was reasonable, and we also do it elsewhere, so we might as well throw it into billboards, but I'm completely open to changing that further if we want that number to continue to go down.
I had mentioned 400 feet one of the previous meetings, just based on a reference to a particular piece of land, and there was a billboard on one end of the land, and to see it on the other end, I did not see that there would be any issue of them being too close together.
Cool.
That's why I came up with the 400 feet. So.
All right. We can keep thinking about it, but that's the direction I think is reasonable to go.
And that was a 60 mile an hour or 55 mile an hour speed
Yeah.
limit too. So
Perfect. Okay, great. What else? We added, or we separated the section on electronic message centers out from the original text because it used to just be in all of the general regulations. So now it has its own section if people are looking specifically for that code. We went over a lot of this with Scott, who's here from the city council, who has obviously a background in signs. And I think we were all pretty comfortable with where this language got at the time, so I haven't proposed any further changes to that, except that we did recently get a request for an electronic message center at Service Food. And technically, our code says that since it's within 400 feet of a residential area, they should be required to get a conditional use permit. But in their case, the sign is not facing the residential area, and there's also a building in between. So, and it's a double-sided. So you would have to get, per our code currently, it doesn't give you the option to say it's a single sign, even if it's double-sided. So they should be looking at a conditional use permit, but it doesn't make sense necessarily. Like, common sense doesn't say that they should have to apply for a conditional use permit to put up an electronic message center there where they already have a digital billboard or like a digital sign. So I added another line of text, which you'll see in red, which I think helps clarify and maybe just cleans that up a little bit. So a double-sided configuration will be considered a single sign when applicable. And then I might need to add a little bit more language about zoning administrator can say, well, so, okay, I don't know if I'm explaining this well. If you're standing in the parking lot of Service Food and you're looking at their sign, if you keep looking past their sign, there's Walgreens. On the other side of Walgreens is a residential area, and it's residences that are owned by Service Food. The signs are not facing that direction, but technically, if you do a buffer around it, it's within 400 feet. That said, there's a building in the way, and the signs are not facing that direction. So common sense says you would not need a conditional use permit. Agree?
Yes, but then wouldn't the CUP just be granted? I mean, if there's nobody to object to it? I don't know,
I mean, I guess technically if they do an
Yeah,
application.
I hear what you're saying completely, but it just becomes tough to tailor to kind of one specific
business.
example.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying, and I mean, from a practical standpoint, right, there's no impact, but that would just be part of the CUP application. I know it's like a separate step that Service would have to go through, but I don't think there'd be any facts to show that they wouldn't meet the elements of a CUP.
Okay. Okay. So maybe not adding further language then, we would just keep it with a double-sided configuration would be considered a single sign. Do you agree with that at the very least?
Yeah.
Like if you're doing a standalone sign, it's one sign?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna write a note. Okay. Good. This section is just getting updated general provisions, which is just the rules for all of our different zones and includes things like not putting stuff in the right of way and just those basic things. That section's gotten a lot shorter since we removed temporary signs and community events and the electronic message center signs, because those used to all fall under the same general provisions section. So, oops, I forgot to add the actual language for temporary signs and community events. But again, we've been over that many times. The language is there on pages 35 and 36. 35, just page 35. Temporary signs and community events. We've been back and forth about how to classify some of our signage related to community events, and this is what we've ended up with. And I think we all feel fairly comfortable with that, so no suggested changes to that section. And that's everything I've got. That's our overarching update, and then here's your document on that. So if you want to spend some time on it and send any, you could feel free to send stuff to me by email if you'd like it incorporated in notes before the next meeting. Otherwise, we can just continue conversation.
I think it's great.
We're gonna get there.
Makes me, it helps me review it a lot easier than
Okay, good.
how I could before.
Cool. Okay.
Time well spent.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
I'm still standing here.
All right, so anything else on the sign ordinance?
Just
Or-
one
Yeah.
question was now, how do we enforce this? I mean,
Yeah.
just a question.
Yeah, so our code enforcement officer, April Zumach, would be the one who would, if somebody calls in a complaint, a lot of times it's complaint-based, or if there's something just like very visibly egregious, then the city would go through the process of first sending a letter saying this is why you are not in compliance, and then this is the next steps if you do not come into compliance. So, and then the city attorney is alerted at that point, and then if it goes further, then it's generally handled through the city attorney's office.
Okay.
But yeah, we have one
Fair
person on staff who's either responding to stuff that she sees when she's out and about, so she'll have to get very acquainted with the new code, or complaint-based. If somebody says, hey, this billboard is definitely closer than 400 feet to this other billboard.
Hopefully that came up well before. it would be
Hopefully it does,
recognized.
but you never know. It happens.
Is the zoning enforcement section its own standalone part of the ordinance, or it's not meant to be a part of this at all, is it?
The
sign
enforcement
ordinance?
section,
Yeah.
like who does the enforcement?
Yeah, and like what would
the
be, like
language for that?
how does it get escalated from there, you know?
Yeah, I guess I'm not entirely sure what our exact language is currently. I just know what the normal day-to-day, how that looks. I don't know how that's reflected in the code entirely, because we don't, I mean, as you're seeing from this section on sign code, there's nothing specific to the sign code. That's not to say that it doesn't exist elsewhere in chapter 154. I just don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So if they're not in compliance with something on here,
Mm-hmm.
in here isn't where we say this is the penalty for not being in compliance with our code.
There's a separate section on penalties that
Yeah,
applies to
that's-
all of chapter 154, but I don't remember what it actually says. I just know that when things occur currently, it goes to our code enforcement officer to follow up on it, and then it can go in a variety of different directions based on those interactions. But in general, we'll say things like it's a misdemeanor or it's an X. So, and then it would run through those processes. Good question, though. I think we should have a section in there that says penalties are, like, look at section blah, blah, blah for penalties. And I don't know that we do that right now, so.
Yeah.
I don't think it's absolutely necessary either. I'm sure it's there.
Yeah.
I believe there's a state statute that gives cities the power to enforce their zoning ordinance. Obviously, there's case law that's been developed that gives cities specific powers to
But if
regulate
someone's
specific things,
specifically-
so, yeah.
Yeah, if somebody's specifically looking at the code and saying, well.
Well,
I just wanna
if
not
I don't,
confirm it.
yeah, if I just don't do
Yeah.
it,
What's
no
gonna
one's
What am I
gonna,
do if I don't?
Yeah.
Well, there it says it right there. No.
Yeah. Good. Okay.
all right. So next thing on the agenda is parking in B6 zones.
Yep, so I wrote you a memo that was relatively vague. I wasn't sure how appropriate it was to name the specific business that has requested that the city look at this, but there is a business in a B6 zone who says, "Hey city, will you please talk about not allowing overnight parking? It is causing problems for our business." Per our public works director, it is also coming back to the city as an issue because the business itself does not have the staff to do the cleanup. And so our utility crews are going out and doing cleanup in parking lots where there is parking occurring overnight. So that is the request, to look at adding something to our B6 code that would disallow overnight parking and let that business say, the city of Fergus Falls does not allow this. Please move your vehicles on.
Are there B6 zones that have like a residential component to them? People that are living in the B6 zone?
There are not.
No, I looked at the map, and it looks like this includes the mall. So that whole parking lot. And I couldn't tell, is socials in a B6? 'Cause I don't, it looks to
Maybe
me.
we need to clarify that it's less overnight car parking, like if somebody's maybe overindulged in a restaurant, and it's more overnight parking where somebody is sleeping in the vehicle overnight after pulling off of the interstate.
I mean, personally, so just generally, I guess it's, when you look at the Fergus zoning map online, you can kind of tell where it is, but there's not a really good, like, GIS component where you can really, where it tells you, like, this is exactly where it is, or what business is affected, but it looked like maybe Perkins was in that B6, and Walmart, obviously. So I guess my thought generally is that we don't zone based upon needs of one specific business, and it's their private property, and if they don't want people parking overnight, then they should put signs up, say that's not permitted. Because I think there's other businesses and places that I don't know if we should restrict their ability to have cars parked overnight if we just have one business who, the fact of the matter is Walmart has a huge parking lot. And when you go there, you do see some cars parked overnight, but it's a lot of truckers
Yes.
too. And I just think that that's something that as a private owner of property, you should regulate. They have the power to regulate how their property is used, and they can.
Yeah,
Signs
I
out.
would say too, I was confused by the memo a little bit because it sounded like it's the business complaining about its own parking lot, right?
Yes, that's correct.
That they have total control over. I think there are instances where we might look at banning, overnight parking, and that might be appropriate for certain things, but I think Walmart's a good example, so I view this as a private problem, I guess.
Yeah, if it's a private parking lot, why is the Public Works performing the cleanup?
It's a great question, and I do not know the answer to it.
It's a little upsetting, honestly.
Okay, so what I'm hearing matches a lot with what my thoughts have been about this question made to the city, and I am happy to go back with a response saying, sorry, but the city does not see a need to regulate overnight parking in a B6 zone. It has not been an issue for us at other times, and this business is allowed to make their own decisions about who can or cannot park in their parking lot overnight.
Yeah, when you start to think about the evolution of like the EV market and sometimes the charging times that takes and the hours that people may be exiting the interstate and they're traveling, this could be limiting to that as well.
It would also be very difficult for, say, a law enforcement officer who would be tasked with enforcing a rule like this to know if a vehicle is simply parking and charging or if they are staying overnight without knocking on every single window and saying, what are your intentions? So I don't know that we have an ability to put something like this in place and then also enforce it. Right?
Yeah, and it seems like that's what they probably want. They want the city, they want to put that enforcement on someone else other than themselves, because I assume law enforcement is going to say if there's nothing in the code or legally, it's going to be a civil issue and they're not going to address it.
Yeah, so in that case, and this is just maybe not necessarily part of this conversation, but if Walmart says no parking overnight, this is our corporate policy or this is our company policy here in Fergus Falls, could they call the police department and say there is trespassing occurring?
They could. I have had situations, not like similar situations, where some law enforcement agencies will say, I'm sorry, without like a court order, I can't, it's a civil issue and I'm not going to remove someone from the property. But
And that's wrong of them to say that, but.
But that's typically what they do because they don't want to get involved
Yeah.
in, that's practically what happens a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But
So how do you enforce a civil complaint if that's the response from law enforcement?
Yeah, well, I think law enforcement just doesn't want to get involved in certain things. But
So, okay, so I'm putting my broader city hat on at this point, and
so
thinking,
I've had this, I represent a lot of landlords.
yeah,
So I've had people squatting in apartments that don't have a lease per se.
yeah,
And it's they don't even have a right to be on our property.
uh-huh,
And law enforcement typically won't remove that person. I'm not trying to throw law enforcement under the bus, but they're not going to remove that person unless
Without
I get a court
eviction
order,
process.
even though they don't have a lease, even though they have no right to be there, even though they're not a tenant. They'll say it's a civil issue and I have to get a court order to remove them from the property.
that's at least a touchy subject. Parking, I mean, come on, the business is the first line of defense for their own property. They can knock on the window and say, get out of here, or whatever, and then call the police. And if the police don't take any action, that's a different issue.
Okay,
But that's what they should do.
okay,
And then to define overnight, what's overnight?
right.
1 hour, 2 hours? It would be almost impossible to monitor. It's because a few people have littered the parking lots has caused this to be an issue, I guess.
I'd say set up cameras. They can enforce their own.
We could have a smaller parking lot too.
Well, and that's another topic for maybe a different day. But I have a client that fell behind on mowing its lawn, a commercial client, and the city started doing it, and it's like a $3,000 bill for 10 mowings or whatever. So,
Yeah.
if city staff are being devoted to a parking lot that you can't manage, then
Get a smaller
they should be
parking lot.
They should be
charged for
charged.
their time. But again, maybe
Yeah, and
a
I can't
different-
say that they're not being charged. I don't know if that's the case or not, but
they're going to get more than they bargained for when you respond, I think.
yeah. Well, it's not a simple request. You can't just say, hey, city, please tell people they cannot park overnight in a zone. I mean, that's,
Well, it doesn't just affect Walmart. It affects, like I said, Perkins, the whole mall area, potentially socials. I think Maples was out of it, but, I couldn't really tell for sure.
okay, good. I will take this directive and respond back to them. So, okay. Any other thoughts or comments on that section of the agenda? Okay. You want to move on?
Let's move on. Do we need to make a motion that we're not going to do a recommendation, or we're just not going to do a recommendation?
Just don't do a recommendation.
Next thing is staff updates.
Yep.
Cannabis zoning.
Yes, so, as you are likely aware, there were several members of this body who attended a cannabis committee meeting through the city council. They were talking about zoning, et cetera. Then we had a conversation here with Planning Commission. Planning Commission made suggestions to the city council about what zoning would be appropriate for cannabis businesses, and I'm just here to update you on where council landed with it, in case you haven't been following the meetings, but they heard planning commission's suggestions and decided they followed the suggestions for buffer zones, not requiring parks to be part of those. They took the 250-foot limit, but they did not agree with B3 zoning, allowing cannabis businesses in B3. So they stuck with B6 and above, which would include industrial zones. So that's what's getting worked into language right now through the city attorney's office, and it is looking likely that the next time that this would be on the city council agenda would be June 3rd, which is the next city council meeting. So if you're interested, you can watch for that to come in the packet. And then it would go through the normal ordinance update. Somebody would have to introduce it. It would have to have a first and second reading. There's time for comment before the second reading, so things could still be changed between the introduction and when it's actually adopted into code. So there will probably be more conversations occurring, but that's where things sit right now. You have any questions about that?
What was the reasoning to not have it in B3?
Do you want to answer based on council conversation, or not speaking necessarily for the entire city council, but as a member of the council who was part of the discussions?
Again, speaking not for the council, but from my impression, was that the overall opinion of most of the council was they did not want to see these businesses downtown, and therefore that ruled out B3. I think that's the simplest capsule answer I can give you. They didn't think it was appropriate for these businesses to be downtown. There may have been other factors that weighed in that might have been specific to this, that, or the other, but that seemed to be the overwhelming or the primary initiative, you might say, the main reason why people chose to limit it to B6 and above.
And I wasn't at the meeting, so thank you for providing that.
That's my take on it. I think that, to get into the weeds on it just a little bit, if we were looking at doing it downtown, it just seemed like there was going to be all these exceptions and all these other things that were going to have to get tacked on to make it acceptable to people. We're going to need this kind of buffer zone, and what about that specific exempt place and this specific required place? And it was just going to get really awkward and difficult to try and really piece it into a place that would work. It was like, we're just not going to get into that level of detail with it. Let's get something on the books that will move the process forward. And if we got to come back and change it, we will, because this is all changing daily, it seems. By the time the state figures out what they're going to do, we might have to start over. And so maybe at this time next year, we'll come back and there'll be a way that we can, open it up to being downtown. But at this point, to just get something on the books, that's Kyle's phrase, so that as people are coming and asking questions about what can I do, where do I go, there's at least an answer rather than a shrug. And that was get something on the books now, get something that will work, and try not to be too complicated. So that's my take on it. Hopefully that's helpful for you. Questions?
So, and just to be clear, the city is exempt, I believe. So the city, if you haven't seen, has started selling THC products at the liquor store here. What? Hemp derived, yep, the ones that are compliant with our existing law and ordinance. And
Sort
so,
of a different category question, because there's the low potency stuff like that, and then there's the full-blown retail cannabis that was subject to this B6 zoning. And it was a meeting or two ago that we talked about allowing the THC beverages and whatnot at the city liquor store. And again, since that was seen as sort of the 3-2 beer of the cannabis business, there didn't seem to be any objection to opening that up to our liquor store. So that didn't really fall under some of these restrictions with the buffer zones and all of that stuff. It just didn't.
but when the new law comes into effect, city municipalities are exempt, aren't they? From,
They are.
they would still be able to sell.
They could, and you could do municipal sales of the non-hemp
type
Right.
products. But we have not discussed that. That hasn't been a discussion yet, essentially, with the liquor store.
No, but I guess I
It
would
still
say
require
that,
the same licensing that anyone else would have.
yeah, assuming that,
Yep.
I mean, the state has to issue the licenses, and all we can do then, once the state issues a license to someone who applies for one, is permit them, because we're mandated to. We're up to a certain code requirements and all that sort of a thing. But the general sense was that the city wasn't going to take one of the licenses. We weren't going to pursue a license from the city level or to try to monopolize it as we do with the liquor business. We have that option with that business. We wouldn't necessarily have that option with this business. And the potential disaster that could be there to get involved with it just seemed to be something that we didn't want to touch at this point. So let the state figure out what they got to figure out, and we do what we have to do to at least make possible what needs to be possible. That's maybe enough.
Yep. All right, any other questions, comments?
It looks like he might want to ask a question.
All right, anything else?
Nothing from me? Anybody else?
All right, we are adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.